So today on the podcast, we finish off our exploration of what is the contemporary role of immersion, or immersion in theme parks when the type of immersion that early designers once talked about, that is, being removed from the world outside the park, is really no longer fully possible. We now take the outside world into the parks in our pockets, purses, and backpacks via our phones and tablets. Now that immersion is no longer a fully effective tool to create a themed bubble that intellectually and behaviorally removes us from the problems of daily life, immersion is now sometimes treated like a goal in itself. But in a modern technology-assisted society, what then does immersion give us in a theme park? Designers can make an absolutely beautiful recreation of, let's say the desert in Africa or a beach in Australia, and I can admire the artistry of that achievement, much in the same way that I might admire the skill required to make certain types of art exhibits in galleries and museums. Or a beautifully created, dimensional land themed after a movie or video game can remind me of seeing the movie or playing that game. But is that enough in terms of theme park design for what guests want? Last week we started with the question, are the traditional goals of immersion now impossible to achieve through themed lands, largely due to phone use in the parks? But really what we were talking about was this. In a world of pervasive technological connections, what does or what can theming give us in terms of our experience inside of a well-designed park? That is, have the end goals of theming changed in terms of our own experience? And how has smartphone culture contributed to this change? And that's right where we're going to jump back into our conversation today. In our last episode, we looked at how phone usage easily broke the sense of immersion for guests inside the park. For example, it is difficult to sustain the playful sense that you are inhabiting an outpost on Batuu in the realm of Star Wars if while you're standing next to the Millennium Falcon, you're also checking work email or looking at how the Dow is doing on that day. Phones are simply a disruptor of immersion, easily breaking the type of deeply themed experience that Walt and the designers who worked with him, such as John Hench, were trying to achieve in a less technological world. In our last episode, I began to explore how pervasive phone usage was inside the Disney parks. To get these numbers, I counted thousands and thousands of adults in the parks and then noted whether or not they had their phones out in hand, either in use or ready to use. Clearly, most adults in the park would use their smartphones at some point during the day, so my numbers only told me that at a given moment, what percentage of adults had their phones out and ready to use. In common walkways at Disneyland and the Magic Kingdom, I observed between 27 and 28% of adult guests having their phone out ready to use as they passed me on a major walkway. My observed numbers came from Main Street, Tomorrowland, New Orleans Square, and so on, basically large pedestrian walkways that move through each park. Also, on last week's episode, I explained that I initially thought that the Florida parks might have a slightly lower percentage of phone usage than that of the California parks, and this proved not to be true in the Magic Kingdom, but as we'll talk about today, it was true a little bit elsewhere in Florida. Now let me add to last week's numbers. In Hollywood Studios on Hollywood Boulevard, 24.8% of adults had their phones out. And in Galaxy's Edge, right next to the Millennium Falcon, where Disney theming might be at an all-time high, that percentage was 25.75. And then I shifted over to Animal Kingdom. At a conference about theme parks, I had recently seen a study by Will Henderson and others that explored how guests visually represented their experience in the Florida Disney parks on social media. Basically, Henderson and his fellow researchers categorized thousands of photos that guests had posted on Insta in terms of what those photos said about guest experience in each of the 4 major parks. Not surprisingly, a large number of photos from Epcot showed food and drink. Magic Kingdom posts often focused on entertainment, but for Animal Kingdom, in addition to attractions, there was a curious uptick in group photos in certain areas of the park. And this made really good sense to me. In terms of a multi-generational experience with grandparents, parents, and kids, Animal Kingdom is a very inviting park with many activities for those 3 different generation groups to do together. So again, I thought that perhaps Animal Kingdom might have an even lower percentage of visible phones than that of the other Disney parks in Florida. But no, Animal Kingdom's numbers were right in line with the other parks, between 25% and 28%. And to tie all of this down, I checked groups of guests in many different locations in that park. I thought maybe numbers at the front of the park might be higher as guests checked their phones for park information or available lightning lanes when entering. I thought maybe phone usage might be higher elsewhere as guests left a ride such as Kilimanjaro Safaris to book a new lightning lane or maybe check an online map as to where they were going next. But no, that didn't happen. Everything I observed in Animal Kingdom came in within 3 percentage points, even those areas not near the entrance or near an attraction. The walkway between Harambe and Asia, for example, was 28.5%. Just outside of that Starbucks on the main path in Discovery Island, it was 25.5%. So basically, this meant that for most places in the Disney parks, both in California and Florida, at most any time, you could find 1 out of every 4 adults with their phones out. But there were a few outlier experiences that told a slightly different story about phone usage. Phone usage went way up anytime guests were still. Usage went up some in queue areas, but usage went up a whole lot when guests were waiting for a performance. One night I walked the length of the Magic Kingdom parade route twice, about 20 minutes before each parade. I counted adults for the length of the route from the parade gates back by Tiana's up through Town Square. For the 8 p.m. parade, 40% of adults had their phones out. And not just out, most adults here were actively watching or reading something on the screen. And for the 9:30 parade, it was 42%. The highest percentage I found in any park over many different trips was at Epcot. People waiting, mostly sitting, around World Showcase Lagoon for the 9 p.m. fireworks. I walked the entire loop starting at 8:30 and counted every adult who was waiting for the show. 49.6% of adult guests had their phones out. Basically, 1 out of every 2 adults had a phone in hand, and in some cases, 2 adults together were looking at the same screen, but I only counted this as 1 phone. So the percentage of adults then looking at a smart device was slightly higher than 50%. Down at the other extreme, there was one general walkway at a Disney park with a wildly low percentage of guests who had their phones out. And this number and the reasons for this very low number surprised me. But we'll talk about that particular example later in today's episode, as this pattern may suggest a fairly easy and low-cost way for designers to engineer areas for lower phone usage within the parks, And lower phone usage is one goal that Disney has openly expressed interest in achieving. For the most part, though, phone use was so prevalent in the Disney parks that the concept of immersion in its traditional form was, for the most part, no longer fully achievable. Most adult guests throughout the day had one foot in the park and one virtual foot outside the park. Again, this speaks to a type of fragmented reality in which many people now sustain multiple centers of partial focus, leaving them a little disconnected from each area that receives part of their attention. So with this level of pervasive phone usage, the question in terms of guest experience in the parks became this: if traditional immersion was no longer a possibility for the vast majority of park guests, why then is immersion still one of the strongest selling points for the Disney parks? And the answer to this question is a little complicated. In both Universal and Disney, as I walked around, I found a small number of guests who did actually become immersed in certain lands. Clearly, one goal for their visit was to experience this type of immersion through role-playing. Typically, each time I visit Disneyland or Hollywood Studios, I see a handful of guests in Jedi and Sith tunics, or dusky vests, muslin shirts, and the sashes of Batuu, and also various bounding designs whose colors are suggestive of certain Star Wars characters. I also see something similar in the Harry Potter sections of the Universal parks. Actually, I see it far more there. A while ago, I used to see it as well in Avengers Campus when that area first opened, but if anything now, Avengers Campus might be a very, very distant third. Outside of these three areas, however, I really don't see much participatory play in the themed lands of Disney parks, or even for popular properties such as Frozen or Avatar. And how many guests do I actually see clearly engaged in role-playing inside of these lands based on how they are dressed or how they act? Well, for the Potter areas over at Universal, I think it's 10% or less. For Galaxy's Edge, maybe 5% or less. It's a small fraction of the overall guests. But this type of themed immersive play is exactly how Disney described Galaxy's Edge when it first opened. This is a press release quote from Walt Disney Imagineering when Galaxy's Edge was first introduced to the public. This land is a place where a traveler's actions build reputation. Living your own Star Wars adventure is a hallmark of the guest experience in Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Rather than watching as events unfold, you become part of a mission, intercept and decode transmissions, and beyond immersive play, Disney suggested that the Disney Parks app was now designed to track your Star Wars reputation from visit to visit. Again, a quote from the year that Galaxy's Edge opened. Regardless of how much you engage with the app, your progress is tracked and rewarded with various achievements, rankings, and credits that can be used to purchase in-game items. Your profile is also saved between park visits and even carries over to the opposite coast's Galaxy's Edge. To put this all simply, this is how Galaxy's Edge was rolled out, with the idea that an immersive experience combined with role-playing would evolve and continue over multiple visits. But the promotional focus of an immersive experience in any land, including Galaxy's Edge, tends to decrease over time. In my experience, immersive areas have the greatest potential for emotional impact during a guest's first visit to any new land. In Galaxy's Edge, I had a sense of awe the first time I saw the full-sized Millennium Falcon stationed just outside of Smuggler's Run. On that first visit, the land did feel immersive. But over time, as the newness wore off, so did the sense of believable immersion. When I walked through Galaxy's Edge this past weekend, I'm not even sure I made full mental note of the Falcon as I passed it. And this arc from a focus on immersion to a focus on familiarity is even how cast members evolve through the land over years. For example, Galaxy's Edge supposedly still uses a language called Batuese, which as best I understand it is something like expressions from the Star Wars written language of Arabesh translated into English jargon. Bright suns means good morning, refreshers or restrooms, and for our episode here we should include that the Batuese name for smartphones is datapads. But it's been years since I've heard any cast member use any of these phrases, even bright suns, which during the land's first year I heard fairly often. Likewise, it's been many years since I've heard cast members use any Na'vi expressions over in Pandora at Animal Kingdom, like Kaltixi, which supposedly means hello, nor have I heard any cast members on Pandora refer to the Avatar movies as documentaries like they did when this land first opened. So with this, these highly themed spaces become less exotic over time, and by that I mean less traditionally immersive. So if immersion isn't the long-term primary role of these spaces, then what is the point of all this theming? Well, there's some easy answers that I can list off. These lands are lovely locations for creative selfies and family photos. Also, just being in these places for older guests creates a type of nostalgia for a time when more direct immersion was possible. And also there's the marketing value of deep theming. Simply telling guests that there's a new highly themed land where they can have their own Star Wars or Marvel or Zootopia adventure is a successful way to generate public interest in visiting that new land, even if the vast majority of those guests will never engage in a type of themed role-playing there or feel a strong sense of being transported to another world. But beyond this, I can see some more complex answers to the same question. Perhaps one answer is this, that themed lands are now a type of contemporary art, and at times Disney encourages guests to appreciate the design of these areas, much like one might appreciate a painting or a sculpture at a museum. And if we're supposed to admire the lands, then it doesn't really matter if our phones are out or if we're hooked into work emails back home or not. Because admiration means that we as guests are standing at a distance from the work of art or the work of theming and are appreciating its presentation and construction from a small distance, much like we would in a museum. Admiration also suggests that we are largely viewing a land at a small emotional distance as well. Just as visitors to, let's say the Louvre in Paris, can appreciate the painting of the Mona Lisa without feeling like they're occupying the world that the Mona Lisa also occupies. So admiration puts guests in a different mental state than does immersion. But this type of artistic admiration is exactly how some Imagineers have framed one way that guests might approach their works in the park. This is in part how Imagineer Joe Rohde described Pandora when it first opened in Animal Kingdom. The research that goes into these parks is not merely research into the real world, he said. It's research into the great works of art of all of those who have come before. This is how it works. This is art. In a more recent interview, Rohde doubled down on this approach, explaining that the creation of theme park lands is the most complicated art form, I believe. that exists in the world. It involves every other art form that there is inside of itself, and it should be thought about like that, which I guess is academic, more philosophy, more thinking, more seriousness, architecture, painting, sculpture, music, landscape design. Every possible art discipline that exists is incorporated in this art form. Even in very recent Imagineering videos, such as in the series We Call It Imagineering on YouTube, Imagineers have started to talk about the design elements in the parks much in the same way that a docent might talk about works of art in a museum, focusing on color, perspective, point of view, and the overall visual composition. This is a quote from We Call It Imagineering's recent episode on the castles, in which Imagineer Colleen Myers talks about the new color scheme for the Disney World castle. We've updated the color every time we've repainted it, she said. We look at all the old photos, the films, light hitting the castle. We put that all together trying to evoke an emotion. And this approach, I would say, is useful in educating the public about the high level of artistic presentation inside of a Disney park. But I'm not really sure that this is how most guests experience the parks as a type of modern art museum. And then there's this answer. For a large segment of Disney's core audience, I'm not sure that immersion is a large selling point anymore. As I've mentioned, at least for me, immersion feels most palpable on the initial visit to a new land. On the 5th or 10th or even 20th visit, the felt sense of being immersed decreases greatly. But the sense of immersion is replaced by something else that is valuable, specifically a sense of familiarity. And by that I mean being in a well-designed and well-cared-for location that holds a number of personal memories. In terms of real estate, this type of familiarity is sometimes called hominess. And this is actually what I think is driving a lot of repeat visitation to the American Disney parks. That sense of being in a familiar, comfortable, well-designed area. In borrowing concepts from real estate, I might describe the hominess of the Disney parks in this way. People are drawn to certain theme parks because those parks are warm and comfortable, filled with distinctive and unique architectural features that suggest a welcoming charm. But this, too, is different than immersion. Hominess is a sense of relating to a familiar park setting through comfortable emotions of connection. And this, I really think, is what pushes more Disney-focused tourism than immersion. I'm pretty sure that Disney knows this as well. Part of what Disney has developed in the last 10 years, as we've talked about, are these lands focused on immersive details, such as Galaxy's Edge. These lands, when they open, get tremendous coverage in newspapers, magazines, online media, and TV. Immersion is a great selling point. A new immersive environment makes many potential guests curious to visit. But from a lot of personal observation, immersive play is not really how most guests, particularly the vast number of repeat visitors, actually use the parks. But this idea of hominess or familiarity fits well with another trend that Disney has been pushing in recent years. Specifically, in the last 5 or 6 years, Disney has added features that make the parks have a greater sense of comfort or of hominess. In California, Disney added new open green spaces and play areas for families in Toontown. And in Florida, Disney redesigned the World Celebration area of Epcot. That's the central spine of what used to be Future World, to have more seating, more tables, some chaise lounge chairs, and even plugs to charge your smart devices. Both of these additions were about usability and comfort, Neither of these projects got very much play in the press, and to be blunt, maybe building a large outdoor seating and relaxation area in Central Florida beneath the summer sun wasn't the best plan, but still, both of these additions spoke to a sense of hominess, giving people comfortable places to relax, which typically matters more to repeat visitors than to guests visiting a park for the first time. Or to sum this up in a single sentence, one less discussed design impulse that has moved through Imagineering for the past decade is to remake areas in the parks so they speak to the needs of repeat visitors who are attracted to the emotional familiarity of these parks more so than the opportunities for immersive play, even if the press will rally far more around a new immersive land based on a popular movie franchise. This pattern also suggests that over time, the familiarity of a themed area will supersede its original purpose. This is clearly true in Disneyland. When Disneyland opened way back in 1955, Main Street pointed both to the set designs for many period movies that were set during the early part of the 20th century, such as that boyhood sequence in It's a Wonderful Life, and also pointed to a vision of America that some older guests to the park would have personally remembered. Now, neither of these things are true for most guests who visit. Period dramas set in the early part of the 20th century are no longer a popular genre of film, and also, no one alive remembers the first few years of the 1900s anymore. Similarly, Frontierland once pointed to the extremely popular genre of Western films and TV shows that were everywhere in the 1950s and 1960s. But this film and TV genre no longer exists at scale for a contemporary audience. Main Street and Frontierland as places now mostly point to themselves. They don't remind most guests of movies they have recently seen or places that they have lived outside the park. They mostly remind guests of previous visits to Disneyland. That is, their appeal is not about believable film-centered immersion as it would have been in 1955, rather about familiarity and hominess. Basically, for film-inspired, themed lands over years, hominess and familiarity replace engagement, immersion, and themed play. If Galaxy's Edge today still has some of its immersive sheen, this trend suggests that in 30 or 40 or maybe 50 years, the area then will mostly be seen by guests as a place of familiarity, reminding them more of previous visits to the park rather than of the movies that originally inspired the location. But all of this moves us a little outside of where our discussion began in the previous episode, specifically with an exploration of how smartphones change the way that guests engage theme parks, as the outside world of business, school, and home life can no longer be shut out by managing visual intrusions, visual inconsistencies, and sightlines. To put this issue bluntly, there's no possibility of going back to 2006 anymore, the year before Apple released their first iPhone. Smartphones are now part of our daily or even hourly life, even if the presence of smartphones undercut the type of emotional experiences that theming was once meant to deliver. And this is why some designers at Disney have recently started to explore ways to manage or limit smartphone use within the theme parks. Is it now possible to create situations that manage the impulse to spend time scrolling while walking through a themed space like Galaxy's Edge? I do think this is possible, but I also think the answer is somewhat tricky. And let me preface my comments here with this. Back before Disneyland opened, as we discussed last week, Walt and C.V. Wood had two different ideas as to how guests would use the park once it opened. Walt, based on his spending patterns, seems to have leaned more toward the idea that guests would want to experience a type of play when they entered the highly themed areas of Disneyland. C.V. Wood, on the other hand, clearly thought that guests would function more like a large audience or a group of spectators enjoying the entertainment around them, but wouldn't necessarily want to be part of the ongoing drama. These were both theories that were put out there in some form before the park opened, with no one yet really knowing how guests would respond to the place. And so theories about how to manage phone use in the parks at this point are mostly just that, theories that haven't yet been deeply tested. Recently, Bruce Vaughn, president of Imagineering, proposed that Disney might reduce smartphone use within their parks through a type of integrated smart glasses that would add additional story details to the world around guests. Vaughn said, "You're there together with friends and family and people that you care about, and every time you look down at a device or a phone, it breaks that spell." Vaughn then suggested that smart glasses, like Facebook's Meta glasses, might be a means to focus guest attention more on the environment around them. The glasses can enhance the ways we tell stories for our guests, he said, unlocking a world of information about the land that they're in. Vaughn may be right. Again, we're at a stage of untested theories, but personally, I don't see the solution from the same vantage point that he does. And again, as we're in a world of theories, my theory may turn out to be ineffective as well. But basically, I don't think the way to solve the problem of tech in the park is with more tech. And also the solution of smart glasses is going to mostly appeal to and be used by a fairly narrow demographic, specifically reasonably affluent young adults who are already tech-focused. Basically, my questions are things like this. Will a focus on smart glasses fix the issue for the actual multi-generational audience that comes to these parks, such as 75-year-old grandparents and 12-year-old tweens, and those who don't have the means to buy smart glasses for the entire family? I personally don't see it that way, but again, I could be wrong. At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that I found an area within the American Disney parks where there was a significantly lower level of phone usage. Something was happening there that was not happening in the same way in the other areas of the Disney parks. And before I get to that exact location and my reasons why I believe this was happening there, do you want to take a guess where this was? Again, like all of my numbers, this doesn't come from a ride area or a queue or a show area, but from an open and well-used walkway in one of the parks. So play with me here for a moment. Imagine your answer to that question. Where is this unique area that has low phone usage? It's an area that most people listening to this podcast have probably visited more than once. Okay, now I'll give you another hint. It was in a Florida park, not in California. Have some of you now reconfigured your guesses? Okay, now another hint. It was in an area of Epcot. You got it in your head? And when I first saw this trend happening around me, I thought my numbers were off, or I counted an unusual set of 500 guests. So I stayed in that same location and counted additional guests as they passed me, groups of 100 after groups of 100, and so on. The area of Epcot was World Showcase. I sat on a bench at the edge of the walkway in the UK pavilion, a wide and well-used pedestrian thoroughfare much like you'd find in any Disney park, and at first I was sort of confused by the numbers I was getting. But then it became clear why so few people were using their phones. It was really simple. They had other things in their hands. World Showcase at that time was set up for one of its festivals, with booths for food and drink. All of it arranged on small dishes, tapas-style servings where most guests would need 3 or maybe 4 items over the course of a night to make a full meal. Also, most guests would buy a drink or 2, and then it hit me. All you need to do to greatly reduce phone usage is to put something else in the hands of guests, something they enjoy or are interested in. In this case, it was small plates of food or a single drink. Most people won't carry items in both hands while leisurely walking. Part of this is for balance based on how our bodies are designed. People out of habit slightly swing one or both arms in a way to maintain balance as they walk. It's a natural part of our movement. And part of this also is for safety. Unless people are carrying something large or heavy, they will usually keep one hand free and empty while walking just in case they fall. Again, this is a natural part of human movement. And as I sat there in World Showcase, I saw extremely few people with a plate in one hand and a phone in the other. Most people with a small plate or a single drink put their phones away, leaving the other hand free to slightly swing for balance as they walked and empty to catch themselves just in case they fell. Basically, if you have a plate or a cup in one hand and you're walking, there is a really good chance that your phone will be put away and your other hand will be empty. And so one inexpensive solution to draw down the number of phones that are out in certain areas of a park may be something as simple as this. Engineer and design some experiences where guests need to use their hands to carry something or use their hands to interact with something in front of them. But also what they carry or what they interact with needs to interest them. In this, it seems like there might be some low-cost ways to deeply influence lower phone usage in certain areas of a park by managing what guests do with those hands in those areas. Beyond World Showcase, I should point out that over many visits where I observed how people used phones in the park, I had one other observation about how to manage phone usage. I noticed far fewer people having their phones out when they were watching live performers. I think part of this is that we're conditioned not to be rude to others by focusing on a phone while people are performing for us. Focusing on a phone, aside from camera use during a live performance, suggests boredom, which is contextualized as rude. And so live performance was another, although more costly way to reduce phone usage in some areas of a park and to encourage guests to focus more on the entertainment and the environment around them. And so, in certain ways, the experiential goals of old-school theme park immersion, as explored in those quotes by John Hench last week, I think are largely gone. Situations where a significant number of guests had a feeling of immersion in deeply themed areas and of being behaviorally and intellectually removed from the world outside the park. And today it would be impossible to undo people's connections with smartphones and tablets. We live in a world of fragmented focus, where we've trained our brains to engage more than one area of interest at the same time. which is the opposite of traditional immersion. But even in this world, there might be some ways to create smaller or limited experiences of immersion, maybe for 20 minutes or a half hour or so, whereby designers engineer situations that require guests to use their hands, which usually means putting their phones down, or designers integrate more live performers into an area. And these activities would encourage guests, again for maybe up to 20 or 30 minutes, to fall a little more deeply into the themed space and themed experiences around them, perhaps sampling the type of immersion that many guests likely experienced decades ago in a far less tech-focused culture. And there may be more ways to achieve this beyond the examples I list here, and if you have an idea as to what would encourage deeper focus on theme lands around guests, I would love to hear it. But the fragmented focus of many guests through highly themed areas of a modern theme park isn't really about a sustained sense of traditional immersion anymore, as much as it is about the art and familiarity and family experience that's there. And maybe really that's what audiences now expect from theme parks, even if the marketing materials are still focused on old school language of immersion, as that is a promotional button that brings people into the parks as places of traditional immersive experience. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode. Lastly, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Subscribers are the people who keep this whole enterprise running. You can support our podcast by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available anywhere else, including some multi-part album series. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to ensure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in this week's show notes. So, until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.